Harold Whitaker, now 60 years old, had never intended to grow old alone. Life, however, has its own plans. After losing his wife Margaret to cancer a decade ago, the silence in his modest countryside home became unbearable. The empty rooms echoed with memories, and even the tick of the clock seemed too loud. The grief gnawed at him in quiet moments, which were now endless. It was Harold's daughter, Emily, who first suggested he get a dog. "You need someone," she had said gently, pressing his hand. At first, Harold resisted. He was in his early 50s, set in his ways. What did he know about raising a puppy? But one Sunday afternoon, on a whim, he drove to a small animal shelter 2 towns over. That's where he met Max. Max was the runt of a litter of golden retrievers, curled up in the corner of a crate, his ears too big for his head and his paws comically large. When Harold knelt down, Max lifted his head and trotted over, tail wagging, and rested his tiny chin on Harold's shoe. That was it. Decision made. Bringing Max home changed everything. House training was a mess. The first few nights were sleepless, filled with whimpering and accidents and endless walks in the yard at 2 a.m. But Max learned quickly, and Harold found himself laughing more than he had in years. Max had a knack for sensing Harold's moods. On bad days, he'd press close, laying his head on Harold's lap. On good days, he'd race Harold to the mailbox, tail spinning like a helicopter blade. Every morning, they walked the misty trails behind the house, a place Harold once reserved for solitary reflection. Now it belonged to them. They would explore the woods, Max chasing butterflies and Harold telling him stories he would never tell another soul. They ate dinner together, watched old movies. Harold even read aloud to Max, who would tilt his head like he understood every word. Their bond was quiet but unshakable. Max wasn't just a pet. He was a companion, a confidant, the last family Harold had left nearby. For 8 beautiful years, they lived like this. Seasons passed, and Max grew into a strong, golden-coated shadow that followed Harold everywhere. Then one ordinary summer afternoon, Max disappeared. It had been a warm day, bright and breezy. Harold had let Max off-leash on the trail, as he always did. Max knew the paths better than Harold by then. They had just passed the old wooden bridge when a rabbit burst out of a bush. Max barked excitedly and gave chase, just as he'd done 100 times before. "Max, come," Harold had called, laughing at first. But this time, Max didn't come back. Harold searched the woods for hours that day, calling until his voice gave out. As dusk settled, he returned home, hoping to see Max waiting on the porch. He wasn't. That night, Harold left the door open, just in case. The next day, he printed flyers with Max's photo. He posted them in grocery stores, vet offices, and telephone poles for miles. He visited shelters, begged on radio stations, checked every lead. But the weeks turned to months, and Max didn't return. People told him to move on. "He's just a dog," some said. But Harold knew better. Max was family. 6 years passed. Seasons shifted like chapters in a book Harold had grown tired of reading. The leash stayed hanging on its hook by the door, untouched, gathering dust. Harold stopped walking the trails. The garden, once so lovingly kept, was overgrown. He spoke less and smiled even less. Life had quieted once again, this time even heavier. On a rainy April afternoon, just days after his 60th birthday, Harold sat on his porch watching the drizzle pattern on the old wooden boards. He was nursing a cup of lukewarm tea, lost in thought, when a sound cut through the stillness. A bark. He froze. It was distant, muffled by rain, but it was there. A bark so achingly familiar it stopped his heart for a moment. He stood up, slowly, the tea forgotten and falling from his hand to shatter on the floorboards. Eyes scanning the mist beyond his gate, he waited, breath held. Then he saw it, a shape, muddy and lean, coming up the trail. The gait was slower, the fur grayer, but there was no mistaking it. Max. Harold's knees buckled. Tears spilled freely, unashamed. Max trotted up the steps and leaned into his chest, whining softly, tail wagging with a force that could shake the heavens. The years melted away in that moment. The pain, the loneliness, all swallowed by reunion. Harold didn't sleep that night. He stayed curled up on the floor beside Max, who had fallen asleep with his head on Harold's lap, as if to say, "I'm home. I'm sorry it took so long." Over the next few weeks, Harold noticed things. Max's paws were worn, his movements slower. He bore a small scar above his right eye. He had clearly been through something, maybe many somethings. A vet visit revealed he had been chipped, but the information had been wiped or corrupted. Someone might have taken him. Maybe he escaped. Maybe he wandered for years, always trying to find his way back. But none of that mattered now. Harold brought the garden back to life. The trails behind the house saw footprints and paw prints once more. Neighbors began to wave again. And laughter, actual laughter, echoed from the Whitaker home for the first time in years. Max had returned with a little less youth, and Harold had a few more wrinkles. But in their hearts, nothing had changed. They were two souls stitched together by fate, separated by circumstance, and reunited by something that Harold could only call a miracle. In the end, Harold believed Max came back because he never stopped calling for him. Not with his voice, but with his heart. And Max, no matter where he was, had always been listening. Together again, they walked slower, but with more purpose. As if every step was a blessing, and every bark a song of home.